So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of the RGM Experience podcast with me, Carl Maloney. A podcast where we delve into the grassroots music industry and beyond and find interesting people within it. So today's, ladies and gentlemen, we don't need to introduce him. He's here. Dave Haslam. Hi, mate. How you doing? You all right?
Oh, I'm going to be as interesting as possible for you.
Right, okay. No,
I've read the brief.
Fair enough. You've got everything all sorted. So DJ, author, interviewing. I class you as a bit of a historian because I love the historic posts that you put on Twitter, stroke X. That I really enjoy those. You know, all the old like tickets from the HACIENDA days, particularly how much bands used to charge for performances and stuff, and and you putting gigs on in your old historic knowledge.
I was looking the other day at
Yeah.
yeah, especially in around 86, 87, putting gigs on at the Boardwalk,
Yeah.
which was at that point 200 capacity venue. And yeah, it's kind of Spacemen 3,
Yeah.
50 quid. Uh, I paid the wedding present 100. I noticed.
Wow.
I
There we
know. So anyway, and normally ended up making about 3.5 quid.
Yeah. I just love those like little flashbacks of history, and
Yeah.
you must have such an archive on your hands
Well, I
with.
have all my, in fact, I'm just sat here. I've got all my notebook, this is 1987
Wow.
diary. I've got my diary for all the years, basically.
Yeah.
And it's not like, one of those diaries about, what I ate for dinner. It's the diary where I made notes about, what I wanted to get involved in and timings of what bands I put on, what time they were going to go on, and addresses, and also a list of the alcohol that I might have to buy for backstage with bands, a case of Red Stripe for Sonic Youth and stuff like that, basically.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and me being like quite well, I say new to Manchester. I've been here nearly 6 years now, moving over from Sheffield, and I just love to see the history of it and people like yourself just sharing that rich history that Manchester has provided the world, really.
Yeah. In fact, the other day I found my first gig at the Lead Mill, Sheffield.
Oh, nice.
I think that was 88,
Wow.
September of 88. I used to go over once, no, every week, in fact, not once a month, every week on a Friday. And at that point, I was doing Thursday and Saturday at the Hacienda and Friday at the Lead Mill.
Wow.
And obviously, I was younger then and full of energy. But yeah, I mean, it was. I think I kept all my diaries in case HMRC came after me and were like, you got this legendary status, Mr. Haslam. Where's all the cash? And I said, well, it's all gone to the wedding present, mate.
That's interesting. I'm just trying to remember my first gig at the Lead Mill. So 88, I'd have been 10. So I think I was like 15 and I watched a band called Blammo with my first
Okay.
ever gig at the Lead Mill.
Yeah, I think I'd been earlier in the 80s. I went over, in fact, with a certain ratio and a band called the Railway Children,
Mm.
because there was at that point the beginnings of bands inviting DJs to play alongside them. What I
Mm.
mean, warm up for them,
Yeah.
and was beginning to pick up a bit of a name even then.
Yeah.
And then the residency from the Lead Mill, came about. I think it was about 88.
Wow. Wow. It's such a shame that venues are struggling at the minute just with
Yeah.
politics and all that kind of stuff surrounding it. Another one of these historic venues that um, we just hope it's going to stick around and those bully boys don't fucking take this culture away.
Yeah. Well, also it's a good size. You
Mm.
know, a lot of this is about the size of the venues. As I say, the Boardwalk was 200, and then it moved up to 400 at the end of 1990. But I get people still asking me, where should I go in Manchester? People who are coming to the city,
Mm.
who want to, investigate what's going on now, and see what the scene is like. And I always say to them, don't go to a venue that's got a capacity of more than 350, because in terms of DJing, once you go above that figure, the DJs have a little tendency to kind of compromise in order to, please enough people to fill the venue. Not always, but often.
Yeah.
and then you'll if you stick to under 350, you'll see bands who are still new or emerging or too weird for the mainstream, and that's the stuff that you should be seeing.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask you, Dave. I've just been asked to do some DJing, Dave, and I've never done it before. For a club called Day Fever. I don't know if
Okay.
you've seen it. Do you know it's for the over 30s, and it starts at 3 in the afternoon and finishes at 8.
Yeah,
And, I was speaking to Chris McClure, who runs it
yeah.
recently, and he's asked me to have a go at it. And I've just said to him, you don't want to ruin your nights, do you? I've never done it before. What tips would you give somebody just,
Well,
getting out your comfort zone and trying it?
I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of obviously it works well in our favor, us DJs. It works well if we pretend that it's a really, really difficult job to do, and
Okay.
it takes years of experience and hard work and practice. But in reality, it doesn't really. I think I still maintain that the most important thing about what a DJ does is choosing the right music,
Mm.
and then which is, if you're choosing stuff you really believe in, that isn't hard. But slightly harder is programming it,
Mm.
and that's the difficult bit where you put it in the right order. So it keeps people on the dance floor, or it takes them, to use the cliche, takes them on a bit of a journey.
Mm.
I mean, I like to do 2 3 hour sets,
Yeah.
and you can't just put a banger on and then another and then another. You have to be a little bit more subtle than that, and connect with people using, in a way, different kinds of emotions. Excitement, joy. There's even room, I think, in a DJ set for something that's a bit thoughtful or melancholy. I mean, I still would play Unfinished Sympathy by Massive Attack. Now, that isn't a record that's necessarily going to send you out into the world skipping down the road. It's gonna connect with your heart and your soul, and hopefully your dancing feet. But it's not some joyful banger. But so it's down to the music choice and the programming, and then you get used to the technology. Obviously, in my 40 odd years of DJing, the technology has changed so often in terms of how the mechanism whereby you get your music over to people. Vinyl, and I mean, even when I started, it was all vinyl and it wasn't vari speed. That's something I should maybe explain to you what vari speed is. But there were no Technics turntables,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so but it's changed many times since. And all it is really, as I say, is a mechanism to get your musical choices over to the people.
It might be an obvious question, but how do you know you're losing a crowd? What's the first signs?
Um,
You probably won't know, mate, because you're a legend in that.
well, I do, and to be honest, I'm not. It for me, it's not necessarily, if I do a 2 or 3 hour set,
Mm.
to feel like the crowd are getting a bit restless. That isn't really an issue for me, or even if people are leaving the dance floor, because often those moments will be the moments where I have maybe pushed myself and them into an area that is maybe a bit unfamiliar. And for a lot of people, they just want to hear what they know. But I think as a DJ, if you want to build a career, you've got to play things that people don't know, but which you hope they will like, and that you play them in the right part of the set, so they just kind of get carried away.
Mm.
But so if it's going slightly wrong, for me, it doesn't really matter because I always know how to bring it back,
Yeah.
and I never panic. And but obviously, yeah, if people start leaving the dance floor, I
Yeah.
guess. But the thing is, as I say, not to panic, because you should go into a set knowing, what whatever your 9, 10, 11 big tunes are going to be, and you've always got a big tune in your back pocket. And sometimes, it's a chance to build again.
Mm.
I mean, I DJ'd the other day, and the DJ before me, bless him, he basically played what you can imagine to be like Pete Tong's Rave Classics Volumes 1 to 2. And he played them between 9 p.m. and 11 p.m. So it was all like real, peak time Ibiza bangers. And how do you follow that? and so I just played a couple of reggae records. I was like, you know, we're gonna start again. We're gonna build up. We're gonna get people's ears ready for stuff that they might not have expected, and we're gonna maybe start a bit slow and build it up. And obviously, when I played the reggae, the dance floor kind of semi-cleared, but that was the strategy.
Oh, I like that. I like that. And from I did want to ask you as well because I've read a few of your books in your time, and I was fascinated with your history with journalism in general. Really, you started off doing your own fanzine when it was all paper and stuff with debris and that kind of stuff. How do you think the media has developed since you had your magazine paper form? You know, finding punk fans all over Manchester with this physical thing, and how
Yeah, I mean, then it was a physical thing, and
yeah,
you know back then you go to gigs and there may be a couple of fanzine sellers with their fanzines in a plastic bag, and you'd wander around the club. It would be maybe orange juice at the Hacienda or something like that, or the birthday party. You know, bands like that normally had you'd suss out would be the kind of audience that might read. I mean, that's always a good start. Um, and um, and also my fanzine. Uh, I mean, I guess you could use the word pretentious, but I'm not really bothered about that because I'd rather be pretentious than dead ordinary, you know. So as well as my fanzine having reviews of bands and interviews with bands, it had you know, articles about obscure Russian film directors and left-wing books from the 1930s. So I had to choose my gigs carefully because otherwise I wouldn't sell any. But I, I think the one thing that sort of surprises me, well, is how people really trust a journalist, a writer, or you know, or someone you know like yourself that's online. That you actually can if you're honest and authentic. People want guidance, you know, because back then your problem was access. Uh, you know how so you would maybe I mean I remember writing about a band called Brilliant Corners, who probably aren't remembered much now, but and you know you'd have to sort of really begin at the beginning. You know where who are they? What does the music sound like? Where can you buy the music? Whereas now, in fact, it's almost like the opposite. There's so much stuff that you can access that people need someone to navigate them through all that. So again, a bit like the DJing, the vehicle for a journalist to reach an audience and to turn an audience onto stuff that they're interested in. That vehicle might change over the years, but there's still, you know, it's still there, and it's still about building, yeah, as I say, building trust. Um, you know, and I still, I mean, you know, it's 41 years since I started Debris Fanzine, and I still meet people who are, you know, I remember reading this, I remember reading that. Oh, I bought that record because you recommended it, and that's, you know, that's phenomenal, really, that people care that much. But then I cared, you know, that was the other thing. Same with my DJing. I don't do these, you know, I mean, I'm lucky in that I started in the mid 80s when neither of those things, writing or DJing, seemed to be a way to make a load of money or to be famous or whatever. So you would only do it because you were passionate about what you were doing. Um, but I think that is special because then people pick up on that. You know, it's like the small books that I've been writing over the last 4 or 5 years. They look great and they feel great and they feel special. And the love that I put into that project, I think people feel it when they buy the book or they see the book. And that's I think that idea has guided me, you know, from the very, very early beginnings.
I do sometimes struggle with with the idea just how throwaway things are these days when we cover a band and it just takes one share on their socials and then it's gone in seconds. You know,
Yeah.
this thoughtful thing that you've produced.
Do you get much people delving into the archive?
When I'm looking into the traffic, yeah, on some of the bigger bands, we
Yeah,
do. Definitely not the new people that we cover.
yeah,
Uh, but yeah, it only takes like we had like a Peter Kay thing from a couple of years ago that still gets just when just like because we cover a bit of comedy music and whatever we
yeah,
can. So like the bigger names pick up the SEO and the
yeah.
traffic and whoever's mentioning what at the time, or if there's
I'm
something that
also,
news.
yeah,
Uh,
sorry. I'm also, I do my own Substack now,
huh.
and I put, put a couple of articles onto that every month. And yeah, I mean, I am quite nerdy. I do like looking at the traffic. Uh, but what I found is that the more time I spend on something and making it as good as I can, then the more traffic I get. I'm kind of really, which I'm really pleased about. It isn't, the numbers of people reading it is down to the amount of effort I put in, which is kind of how it should be, really. But yeah, that the idea of I mean, again, people's. It was only the other week somebody said to me, have you ever considered bringing out a kind of compilation or compendium of copies of debris from the 80s? And he said, I'd love to see them all. I'd love to see it because it's, whether in the case of a website, the traffic is low, or in the case of a fanzine, the circulation is low. That doesn't necessarily, that's not necessarily the only measure of how successful that project might be, because as I say, if people remember something from 40 years ago that you wrote, then that's got to count for something. In some ways, it's better than a million people forgetting. Um, and that's where the grassroots things come in. That's where the word of mouth comes in. That's why a venue with less than 350 is still valuable, because it's about the quality of the connections and the relationships around that space.
How do you excuse me? How do you feel about the new kid in town, the AI writers, and then the
Uh,
technology that's coming out around that at the minute?
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's I, I mean, AI images uh, annoy me a lot. AI, it's not really that intelligent. That's the weird thing about artificial intelligence. It isn't intelligent in what we call, somebody's nous. When you say, oh, when you kind of you're intelligent enough to take in other things other than trying to put the right words in the right order.
Mm.
You're thinking about how do I, yeah, how do I lighten this up, or how do I reflect the world around me, or how do I talk to an audience? How do I project soul in what I write? And that's a lot different to just being able to put together some words, isn't it?
It's one of the biggest fights that I'm trying to just figure out really because a few writers have been caught out using AI to write stuff for RGM. So
Yeah,
there's websites out there where you can just copy the text and it'll tell you whether it's a human or not, or whether it's AI,
yeah.
but it's AI saying that. So and you are right. It's not intelligent enough yet. But I did notice that you can put links into AI and to music, and it'll describe the music. It's getting
Right. Okay.
it's going that way. It is getting better. But you can but for me, because I've been trying to keep an eye on it, I've had to play with ChatGPT loads and asked it to review a song just to try and get a vibe of what it looks
Mm.
like, so I can try and
Yeah.
spot it if people are using it on the magazine, that kind of stuff. And
Yeah.
it's definitely out there, and you do see it with other magazines, and you just have to. It's I don't know. It's not a good thing because it's not very interesting.
Oh.
You can tell when somebody's told it, asked AI to be funny. It's just crap.
I think yeah, like I say, these things all always change, and I still think word of mouth is so important with
Hmm.
getting across what you do, and all your various projects, and not being lowest common denominator. But it used to be funny trying to, because obviously in the 80s when I was writing, because I went on and did a little bit of work for the NME, back then you couldn't just link to, somebody's Bandcamp. If you want to know what this band sound like, here's a link to their latest single on YouTube. You would actually have to sit down and try and work out what do they sound like, and I used to resort a lot to they sound like a cross between something and something else. And there were a number of times when I later met the band and they'd say, "Oh, thanks for the review in the fanzine, but we've never heard of either of those bands that you said we were similar to." But you just had to do your best. But the other thing is that actually, I think that we've somehow I think people are less dismissive of music now online. I don't mean on Twitter, but I mean people who write about music do tend to write about things that they want to champion. Whereas there was, I think, a phase where people enjoyed putting bands down. And certainly if you read the music papers in the 80s and the 90s, there would be bands who would suffer from a real kicking by a journalist. And you don't get that now. I don't think as much, and for a number of reasons. But at one point, it kind of frustrated me because I used to like that kind of writing, someone just tearing a band apart. But I think, given the amount of hate that's out there in the world when it comes to politics and society, maybe it's good that music has calmed down and it's seen much more as a positive thing in people's lives.
Yeah, and and as as an interviewer, I'm trying to get better at this thing called interviewing. You've interviewed many, many, big legends and characters within the music industry and art, and the creative world. What makes a good interview for you?
If the interviewee reveals stuff about themselves that nobody knew. I mean, I don't necessarily even mean a fact, but I've always liked doing on-stage interviews where you've got an audience. It's very stressful. 700 people watching you interview John Lydon is quite a stressful experience because you've also got to deal with the audience who can be a little bit chaotic. But there, people can read the body language and the attitudes of the person I'm interviewing, as well as listen to the words. And a few times I've interviewed people, and I think probably if it had been if I'd written it down, it would have looked like a not very interesting interview. But if you were actually there, you would see quite a lot about how people relate. I mean, I remember interviewing Terry Hall. He was very revelatory, as it happens, about what he was saying. But he spent the whole interview with his legs crossed and his arms like that, and him looking slightly like that at me. And so in terms of his body language, it was so defensive and awkward that it kind of told a really big story, whereas interviewing Nile Rodgers, for example, Nile was he was aware the audience was there. He was very warm towards me, warm towards them, very helpful. Niall did the thing where he was almost like nobody's ever asked me that question before type. He knew how to come across. And, yeah, so I guess just that, I mean, I've had a few people who've revealed themselves to be idiots. I interviewed
Trying not to do that today, Dave. That's my number one goal. Don't be an idiot in front of Dave.
I'm still trying to be interesting, but I got, yeah, I mean, a couple of times I think it was twice I interviewed Marquis Smith in front of a live audience. And, that was quite difficult because it was difficult enough if you met him in the pub and interviewed him. But, if you met him in front of an audience, and there was one interview I did, and afterwards everyone was like, he just took the piss the whole time, Dave, and I was, but I didn't care because it was kind of, that's what people would have wanted. It's like, and I felt like it's part of the circus. If I interview Marquis Smith and he gives reasoned and reasonable answers, people are going to want their money back. But if I interview Marquis Smith and he looks like he's about to bite my ear off, people are like, that's well worth a tenner. Um, but I mean, yeah, I mean, when I make a list of who I've interviewed over the years, I'm always kind of astonished at that how at that list, and obviously very grateful for them to get involved, and I feel very lucky that I've met all these people close up.
How do you like reflect back on, the history that you've had, all the DJing, that's what that's what the top thing that comes up when you search for Dave Haslam. Then you interview, when you dig a bit deeper, the interviewing and that kind of stuff, and the historian side of it. How do you reflect back on a career of 40 years on that?
Well, I think it is just down to the people that I've
Mm.
met, and I don't just mean whether the likes of David Byrne and Nana Cherry and Paddy Considine and all those people, Jeremy Deller, Andy Weatherall. I mean, they're all fantastic people to hang around and to talk to. But I was thinking this the other day. I was thinking about I went and had a coffee with a friend of mine, and I thought something which I hadn't thought for a while, which is like, who's my best mate? I know that's like a weird thing for a 62-year-old to think, kind of thing, a 12-year-old would think. But I kind of realized that I hadn't really got best mates. I haven't really got a crew that I kind of go to the pub with. But what I have got is literally hundreds of people who I've connected with, and they've responded to my DJing or my writing, and 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 I know that because I saw it happen, but also I know it because on social media people are so enthusiastic and encouraging, and I do my book tours, and they're not like huge affairs. I'll go all the way to Bristol and there'll be 45 people, but the 45 people who come out on a Monday night and paid a few quid to hear me chatter about books on my life and stuff. And I mean, they're normally people I would be happy to invite to my house. Do you know what I mean? They're great people and they're interested and they're interesting. And there's not many jobs where, you can have those long relationships. And the longer it goes on, also, for example, with my DJing, I've witnessed people's lives just being played out in front of me, um, people who maybe started to hear me DJ when they weren't legally allowed in a club, so they were 16, 17, or even younger. And then over the years, I see them, they still follow me, they're still loyal. And, they've maybe had a couple of boyfriends or a couple of girlfriends, and then they meet the one, and, and then they get married, and, and then they have kids, and, and they still maybe come out, or at least to keep in touch with them on social media. And there's hundreds. And it's just that sense of having created those communities of people and having still feeling like I'm feeding them and they're feeding me, and is very, very special, and not to be morbid, but I'm now getting to the point where, some of them get ill and some of them pass away. And it's, it feels like family in some ways, and it's actually quite a difficult thing to deal with because I have seen them and been with them for 25, 30, 40 years, and so although I don't feel like I've got kind of busy mates, I've got lots of relationships that are really meaningful.
Well, you mentioned social media there, and you mentioned there's a lot of hate there in the world. I'm just intrigued why you choose Twitter as your social media main output for why do you choose that particular one? It's my favorite for me personally. I love X Twitter, whatever it's called. I just think I just love how instant it is, and just the opinions on there, and it's supposed to be free speech, more than what the other ones are apparently. I'm just wondering why you.
I don't know. I think it kind of suits me personally because I am interested in lots of different things. I'm like Mr. Curious, and I can I see it as a network as well. I'm not one of those people who uses it just to blare out a message like, all right, I can text the world, go.
Yeah.
I also very much use it as, a two-way street. And I like amplifying good messages. And if people are doing good work, I like to push their stuff as well. So I kind of like that. Again, it goes to the idea of community, I guess. But but also just in my DJing, especially, it's a very quick way to spread the word. On 2 days ago, we announced a gig that I'm doing in September at the Golden Lion in Todmorden, which is a really great, for us DJs. It doesn't sound like much, but it is a really, really good gig. Very, very good audience. And it'd be the third time that I've been. And 48 hours later, they've sold 75% of the tickets. And that was a couple of tweets. I haven't even started thinking about, or they haven't even started. We haven't done a Facebook event page or any of that. So that's wonderful because it also means that we're not spending a load of money on flyers and adverts and again, not to keep going comparing and contrasting with the old days, but I remember putting on DJs, say, in the mid-90s. You'd have to do 20,000 full color flyers. You'd have to. I had a database that was people's home addresses, and I'd have to photocopy 200 little newsletters and go to the post office to buy 200 stamps, send them all off. So the cost and the effort of putting events on, it was huge. Whereas now, if you know how to work the system a bit and you've got a reasonable following, you can cut the marketing spend for an event down to nil. And some of the stuff that I do, it wouldn't be cost effective in the old days, whereas now it is because the marketing budget is nil.
Yeah, well, let's move on to the author side of Dave then. So I can remember having you in my car driving about, Dave, when this book came out first. How long ago was it since this come out now?
I think that must be 5 years.
5 years ago, yeah. When I've just moved to Manchester, then yeah. I remember driving about, and you just sold your record collection. How do you feel about that record collection having its own life now?
Oh well, I love it.
Still okay with it?
Yeah, because people are always asking me about it, and there are some things in my life I still haven't really worked out whether they were good things or bad things. I still haven't really processed all this stuff. But the one thing I do know is that selling my record collection was a great thing to do, and I have absolutely no regrets whatsoever about it, which surprises a lot of people. But that's why I wrote the book, because I wanted to explain why I did it and how I felt afterwards. And even though it's 5 years on, I haven't changed my mind about that.
So Art Decades then, so it's a series of books. Did it start off as a series of books? Was that the plan from the start?
Yeah, the plan was a series of books, but I didn't know how many, and I knew the subject matter for the first couple. So it was a project that in many ways I kind of planned it, and if I may, I'll just wave the
Nice.
It's now in the box. So there's the eight books are there, and they slide very nicely into.
I need a box. I've bought them all, Dave. So I'm gonna get one of them boxes.
You do need a box. Well, yeah. I'll see what we can do. We'll send you an empty box.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah. So the second one was about the artist Keith Haring and his relationship to New York nightlife.
Mm.
uh, uh, which was inspired by an exhibition of his at the Tate Liverpool. That one, yeah, and in some ways they do go back to that fanzine idea in the sense that when you've got a little fanzine and you're printing 1,000 of them and you're selling them for 40p by hand at gigs, then and it's a lot of effort, then you come to the conclusion that the things you want to write about are the things that you want to write about most. You don't want to fill it with something that you're not that bothered about because it's time and it's effort. And that idea of taking on projects that I feel passionate about is important. So it's quite and also, like I was saying before, the fanzine was quite eclectic. My DJing is quite eclectic, and the series is, so it kind of reflects me as a person, I think.
What's your how's your archive? Is it a really neat set of things, or is that?
My archive. I want to talk more about the book, so I'd sell more,
Yeah, sure.
but I'm actually sat next to my archive. So, seeing as you asked,
Okay.
I've got what have I got? I've got a um, Hacienda flyers. That's New Year's Eve, 1988. Hacienda 5th birthday invitation, which was one of those expensive productions that Factory was famous for. I've got this is just a few things. I've got in fact, this came up the other day. This is the first Factory Christmas card.
Mm.
No, second one. This is that was given out to customers in December 1983. And there were also newsletters. This is a newsletter from and there is a little form to fill in if you want to become a Hacienda member.
Oh, there you go.
So
Wow.
I've got and I've got a load of that kind of Hacienda stuff, and then I've got flyers from other things, and something that I posted on. I probably lost it now. Something that I posted on Twitter the other day. You'll like this one. I guarantee you will like this one.
Let's have a look.
That's my artist pass from Spike Island,
Oh, yeah, nice.
May
Oh,
1990, which I DJ'd at. And I have a photograph of myself on the day holding my pass. So when you go on Antique Roadshow and they say, "Well, what is the provenance? What can you tell us about this?" I can show a picture of 28-year-old me at Spike Island holding the antique, as it now is.
do you think you'll ever get the urge to sell some of your archives, Dave?
Well, you know what? I sometimes give stuff away. I know that sounds awful because
Yeah.
people will then now email me. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff that I didn't keep on purpose, but there's a few things I just can't part with really. But I've got some really great posters, Stone Roses posters and all sorts.
Well, yeah, I've gone on a little tangent there. Apologies. Let's get back to
Anyway, the books.
Yeah, the books, mate. So one of my favorites one was the Cressa one. I just really, speaking of Stone Roses there, and just his story and the life that he's led and that kind of stuff, and just how much of a right hand man he was to John Squire. That was really interesting just to learn about that side of things.
Yeah, that one. I mean there we go. I mean, as you know, out of the 8, there aren't that many there are only 3 that tell a Manchester story, because obviously I've written about Manchester in my 5 full-length books. Well, not about Manchester in all of them, but I've written a lot, and obviously lots of people document all that. So I decided that I'd only write about a Manchester subject if it was something that hadn't previously been written about. So I wrote a book about the Angry Brigade, who were a group of underground terrorist revolutionaries that were active in the UK, very beginning of the 70s. And altogether, I think they committed about 115, 120 acts of terrorism in England, mostly in London, which meant things like machine gunning banks and trying to blow up the Chancellor of the Exchequer and all sorts of anarchist revolutionary activity. And they're kind of not talked about now because I don't think Britain likes to talk about the conflicts that have happened. It likes to have this rose-tinted view that back in the day everyone lived happily ever after. But I found that some of them lived in Moss Side for a while, some of the Angry Brigade. And although their links to London was well documented, what they did in Manchester wasn't. And they had connections with actually with an underground magazine called Mole Express, and they also, which was very active in Manchester, and also and Mole Express itself had a major connection to a club that was happening in Manchester at the time called the Magic Village. So there's a kind of there's a link between the hedonism and the revolutionaries, which I quite liked. I quite like that where it's more than just music. Music's in the story, but it's connected to people's politics and the so the Angry Brigade story fascinated me. Then, as you say, the Cressa book, which was about. I mean, I met Cressa in 84, 85. Coolest guy around. Described in magazines as the face of Manchester back then. Hung out at Happy Mondays and Stone Roses. Became best known for hanging out with the Stone Roses, John Squire's guitar tech, but he also turned them onto a lot of the music that they were into. He very into his psychedelic stuff and into his fashion. He gave Ian Brown his first pair of flares, and I still maintain that if Stone Roses hadn't worn flares, they would never have been as big as they turned out to be, because the look is often important, even for a band that's trying to be credible. Or is credible, the look is still important. The Sex Pistols, the Jam, go back then, and the look was important. And the haircut's obviously important, and the cut of your trousers. And anyway, so he fell on hard times in more recent years, addicted to heroin, homeless, begging on the streets, begging outside venues he would have once been on the guest list at. So I wanted to tell Cressa's story because, he's a pal of mine, and I was lucky that he trusted me and he told me everything, even things that were very, very difficult for him to talk about. And I also wanted to tell it because, my generation, those of us around in music, in the 80s, so many of us have reason to be grateful that we can still be active in that world, in various ways. But, there's not everybody had some amazing subsequent life, people involved in the scene around that time went in lots of different directions, and I thought it was a nice balance to the glorification of those years to actually talk to somebody who'd properly suffered subsequently. Anyway, you've read the book, so you know that, but I just thought I'd let.
Oh yeah, I want people to hear this and treat themselves
Yeah,
on your website, mate. And then there'll be a link there'll be a link straight to treat yourself to a couple of these books, if not them all, in a nice box as well. So
yeah. Well, the box is 45 quid, and there's eight books in a beautiful box. Or you can get an empty box for a tenner,
nice.
or I'll just send you one,
Okay.
Carl.
Okay. Well, so the last book came out recently. It's a Strawberry and the Big Apple, Grace Jones in Stockport. So just before we get on to the latest book and the last of the series as well, how did you I'm just flitting a little bit with my thoughts, but how did you decide to finish it here?
I kind of felt it was good to bring it almost back home, um, bring it back to a very formative part of my life, early 1980s, and yeah, just bring it back to factory records, a certain ratio, Grace Jones, Stockport. But also because I just decided there were 8, and I had a few more ideas, and I just decided I wanted to do Nick Cave in Berlin because I thought I quite like this. Quite a few of the books, as you know, is about a creative person. Courtney Love in Liverpool, Sylvia Plath in Paris, Keith Haring in New York, and the Picasso in Paris. So, and the effect that they had on the environment and the effect the environment had on them. And even if they were only there for temporarily, how the place that they were in really affected their creativity, inspired it, or gave them a series of pathways. And so I did think about writing about Nick Cave in Berlin because I'm kind of interested in his Berlin years because it was an interesting time in his career. But also I was interested in Berlin in the years he was there, if you know what I mean, in that first part of the 80s. Obviously before the wall had come down and so on. But also because I know the guy who uh, was his flatmate in that era. So I had a really good source. So I had that and a couple of other ideas, and then I had the idea of Grace Jones in Stockport, and I decided there were already only going to be 8. And in fact, we'd already decided that the box would just be big enough for 8, so I couldn't
Okay.
go on and do any more. So I'm like, I've got to choose one. Uh, so I chose to talk about the encounter between a certain ratio and Grace Jones at Strawberry Studios, which was 3 hours one Wednesday evening in November 1980. And so even though it was only a 3 hour encounter, I wanted to explain how they'd all got there and what they were doing there. And because I'd seen a photo by Kevin Cummins' photo of the band with Grace Jones. And even though Grace Jones doesn't remember anything about it, and the episode does not appear in her autobiography, and despite the fact a certain ratio of done so many things in their lives quite rightly, something that happened 44 years ago isn't something they remember particularly in detailed way. So I kind of had to do a lot of Sherlock Holmes type research to pin down what had gone on. I had a bit of a breakthrough in discovering it was the day after she was filmed with Russell Harty, which was one of the most famous parts of his career for sure, when Grace Jones started battering him live on BBC TV. Uh, and and it was the following day she met a certain ratio. But the story is also about connections that Factory, particularly in Tony Wilson, was making between New York and Manchester.
Well,
Uh,
just on that exact thing. One bit that I really loved. It said Tony Wilson and Rob Gretton, they loved New York that much. Where's the quote now? If New York has cool clubs, why the fuck can't Manchester?
yeah,
And then he wanted to bring that nightlife to Manchester. And that was just 2 years before the Hacienda started. So it
yeah.
kind
So in October 1980, September 1980,
of,
um, New Order went over to America to do, well, mainly to New York to do some shows. And a certain ratio went with them. And in fact, a certain ratio headlined because New Order were very new at that point, and nobody really knew that some of them. That at some points they didn't know which who was a singer, let alone and Gillian wasn't in the band. So New Order was a very new project. So a certain ratio went over there to play the gigs and also to record in a recording studio in New York. And while they were there, they played a club called Hurrah. And yeah, I found an interview uh, it at that point, not subsequently, so it's not a rewriting of history, where Tony Wilson is discussing with the journalist that Britain needed a few clubs like the New York clubs, and they mention Hurrahs and Danceteria.
yeah.
And yeah, and I kind of thought, yeah, I'm glad you picked that up because it made it for me. It underlined the fact that Manchester is most interesting when it connects to the rest of the world and and it's least interesting when it just looks inwards and is very insular. And and I think Manchester's connections with New York in that era, and then with kind of Detroit techno later in the 80s, that's really important, and that's about the city looking outwards, absorbing influences, and yeah, and and the fact that the Hacienda would not have existed if those bands and Tony and Rob hadn't gone over to America and seen what was happening in New York,
And one thing I love, because I've drove through Stockport a few times and I've seen the studio, Strawberry Fil Studio. I've seen a little sign and I thought it looks odd. There's a recording studio there, not having a clue of the history behind it at all. And it's heavily mentioned in the book.
Yeah,
And there's a brilliant bit at the end that I won't spoil. People can read it about Grace coming back,
yeah. So
meeting.
bring it right back, because
Yeah.
that thing about yeah. I mean, so many of the books and so much that I write is stuff about the past,
Mm.
and that isn't because I want to live in it, and that isn't because I look backwards all the time in some kind of nostalgic way. It's because I think we need to understand our past to know where we are now and where we're going. It's part of a continuum, past, present, future. And so getting the stories and understanding what was going on in for previous generations is important for us. Sometimes it might give us ammunition or inspiration for what we do in the future. And so the last pages, which you're not going to give away and I'm not going to give away, are basically me coming up right up to the present in Stockport, and seeing how that relates to what happened in 1980 at the encounter, but also back in the 60s, which, as you say, I talk about as well, when Strawberry was first established.
You painted a brilliant picture of Stockport back in the back in those time as well. Just how it's just how industrial it was, and just how completely different it is, obviously, to what it is now. You painted a really nice. I felt like I could picture Stockport how it used to
Yeah.
be. That's how you described it.
Well, also, like in 19, when I started writing the book, I thought the whole idea of Grace Jones being in Stockport in 1980, this glamorous jet setting, Queen of Studio 54, model-esque, beautiful woman striding through post-industrial Stockport, was just a funny image. But and obviously it is, but actually there was stuff going on in Stockport, as there was in places like Hull, Bristol, all over in that era, and probably still today, because there's always underground activity. There's always people trying to do stuff. And I discovered that that November 1980, just a few miles away from Strawberry, there was a little row of shops, and in one of them was a boutique um, called Crazy Face, run by a man called Joe Moss, who a few years later was going to become the manager of the Smiths. And next door was a hairdressing salon co-owned by a man called Gareth Evans, who a few years later was going to become the manager of the Stone Roses. And those two guys were there doing their thing in Stockport, in, you might call it an unremarkable way, or you might not, but they were going to play a part in music history.
So looking back over the series of the books, and which one did you find the easiest, that just flew out of you, and which one did you have to fight a little bit
Well, I
to?
think probably this one, the Grace Jones one, was probably the one that was the easiest, in the sense that I knew the terrain and the people and the music, back to front. I didn't know nobody knew the details. No one could remember. So I was I was no catching up to do. And it was
I like
just,
how honest you are within the book, within the speech, and you quote people, and they're just saying, "I don't know, I don't know. I think,
yeah,
I think
yeah.
this."
And there's one important story that there's two versions of, so sometimes you just have to hold up your hands and say, we'll never know.
Yeah.
But I think that, in a way, well, the one that I enjoyed the most, and I think is probably my favorite of the 8 is one we haven't really talked about, which is My Second Home, Sylvia Plath in Paris, 1956. Because, writing about a poet like Sylvia Plath is not what you would think a, Hacienda DJ would be interested in doing or would even pull off with any degree of success. And there was quite a bit of skepticism when, the book was announced. A kind of like, well, stick to your lane type, dismissive attitude. But actually, it got great reviews. It got one review that said it's surprisingly brilliant, which kind of at least acknowledges the fact that it was a bit of a surprise that I was writing about Plath. But and then I ended up doing a talk at the inaugural Sylvia Plath Literature Festival. So I was kind of embraced by the Plath academics and the fans, which was great because I was, I kind of just wrote it from the heart, really, about her period in her life before she'd committed to Ted Hughes and before she'd had much success as a poet. And when she was in Paris on her own for 2 weeks over an Easter holiday. And but I just found it. I was able to put a lot of ideas and also a lot of emotion into the book. Because I think the weird thing about these books and others that I've written, although they're non-fiction, I think, the last thing I want them to be is a kind of dry encyclopedic retelling of the events. There has to be an emotional core to the story. Keith Haring in New York, Courtney in Liverpool, and obviously there's a lot of emotion in the Plath book, and so that's probably the one I'm proudest of.
So what's coming up next for Dave Haslam then? Obviously let the books breathe and let them just enter everybody's
Exactly.
everybody.
So that's the funny thing about working. I still feel like I work, very much in the kind of underground, grassroots, cult type world, and I'm really so comfortable because it's the only one that makes any sense to me, and it's where I, pick up all my passions and my ideas. But the thing about that is it does take a long while. It can take a long while for people just to find what you're doing and pick up on it. So you're quite right. It needs time to breathe. I always think about, if Wayne Rooney brings out I think he's brought out 2 autobiographies. Each time it has like 2 weeks where everyone's talking about the revelations in the Wayne Rooney book. And then in week 3, they're all, half price in Waterstones or, on the shelves of Oxfam. And they literally have a life of about 2 weeks. But I think when you're dealing with, in the kind of underground type world, it could take a long while for it to percolate through. It's that thing people always talk about, how many people bought the Velvet Underground's first album, compared to what happened later on. And I wouldn't obviously compare myself to the Velvet Underground, but it's how my culture works, and I'm picking up now. When I DJ now, I'm playing Italo disco records from 1983, 84 that I never knew existed in 1983, 84. And it's only through the internet that I've ever been able to hear them. So it works for me as well as a kind of consumer that they've taken me 40 years to discover. And, that's the wonder of it. I've got lots of DJing actually over the summer. I'm doing a new not a new festival, but new to me, a festival in Derbyshire called Timber. I'm DJing there and doing a couple of Q&As. Kendall Calling. I've missed Kendall Calling for the last however many years, 4 or 5 years, but I'm back this year at Tim Peaks on the Friday night, interviewing a certain ratio and then DJing till dawn, I think, more or less. And then I've got I'm doing a 7-inch only DJ set at Folk Cafe Bar on Burton Road in West Didsbury. I just like to do things, Carl, and
I
I'm
know.
like, I look in my diary and I'm like, what am I doing that weekend? You know, I was literally sat in the cafe. I'm like, what am I doing? I've not got anything on that weekend, you know. And the
Yeah.
manager happens to walk past. I'm like, have you got decks? And he's like, yeah. And anyway, so little 7-inch only set at my local cafe, mixed in with a few festivals, and yeah. So I think most weekends now until middle of September, I've got a gig of some kind. So it'll be mostly DJing, and then probably around Christmas I'll start thinking. But I'll be doing I want to do a big book next. I want to do you know, they take me 3 or 4 years to write, but there's a couple. I've got a couple of ideas. So.
Well, Dave, I always feel a lot more bathed in culture just speaking to you, Dave, and everyone, you know, with you again today, mate.
Well, that's good. That's good.
I'm not very cultured myself personally. I think I've got through this interview without making a fool of myself. So I'm
No, but
on the
I don't want to be patronizing, but one of the things that I love as a DJ and a writer is that people pick up my books and give them a go because they think, well, you know, Dave seems to know his music. He's an interesting enough guy. We'll give the book a go. And I love the idea of people who don't read books reading my books. You know, I'd rather have that than people who just hoover everything up, you know, and they're on to the next subject. I'd rather, you know, I like that. So, you know, and I appreciate the fact you've read all the books in this series.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed it. So I'd encourage anybody to click in the link within the description of this podcast on the audio one or the video one, wherever you are. Dig in, jump in. There's a box for them all. I don't think we've mentioned the box enough today, have we, Dave?
Can I hold it up one more time?
Let's see the box. There we go. There we go. And
Beautiful.
And if you want to know why Harvey Cartel was banging on a wall in New York, I just enjoyed that part of the last book as well. I'll not tell people what it is; they can find out themselves. Just little tidbits, like little flashes of just like
little
nice thing,
weird little scenario.
So
well, thank you for having me back on, and
welcome.
I'll see you again in 3 or 4 years when I manage to get another book out.
Well, Dave Haslam, you're an absolute legend. Thanks for joining us again on the podcast. And I wish you all the best for your future endeavors, mate. Nice one.
Lovely. Thanks.
Thank you.